Hello, everybody. This is José Carregal Romero, and the title of my talk is They Had the Same Unnameable Spiritual Injury, Millennial Vulnerability in Sally Rooney's Normal People. This paper is part of a project called The Articulation of Communal and Individual Vulnerabilities in Contemporary Irish Writing, a project funded by the Spanish Ministry of Science. So Normal People is set in contemporary Ireland, and this is the story of Marianne and Kennel, who as high school classmates in a fictional town in the west of Ireland begin a difficult love relationship, which continues on and off until the last year at Trinity College, Dublin. Along the story, Rooney's young characters are affected by pressures like popularity, body image, and money. And these pressures increase the characters' vulnerability and suffering, which becomes intensified by their shameful silences. As we shall see, Rooney's protagonists often struggle with emotional intimacy, and their relationships become affected by constraints like social class distinctions, as well as gender and sexual hierarchies, often established through objectification. So drawing on research on care ethics, vulnerability, and neoliberal affects, I will argue that in normal people, millennial culture is largely characterized by a competitive individualistic ethos, where cruelty becomes the normal behavior. In the story, some physical and emotional wounds like mental illnesses, realities like domestic abuse, these are experienced as unspeakable, and they become internalized as signs of abnormality and weakness in a society that equates vulnerability with failure. If this way of thinking is difficult to resist, it is because neoliberalism makes its rationality the condition for self-advancement and well-being, in this way shaping people's affective worlds. To hide this vulnerability, Rooney's characters usually adopt strategies like passing and concealment, and display an uneasiness that lays bare the inequalities and injustices of their neoliberal culture. So now I would like to turn to the idea of care ethics, because in an interview, Rooney relates that when she was writing the novel, she had been inspired by her readings on care ethics. And this made her imagine alternatives to our, quote, our whole way of life, which is destroying people in an awful pathological way, So following some of the principles of care ethics, Normal People portrays the crisis of these neoliberal individualistic perceptions of autonomy, of personal achievements in a competitive society. Thus, the story eventually favors what Jean Keller, in an article on care ethics, called, quote, relational autonomy, which means that individuals gain self-respect, self-worth, and moral maturity, not through social markers of success like money, popularity, sex appeal, but through an ability, and quoting, to make and sustain connections with others, which is necessary for a full and rich human life. Yet, for most of the story, her characters are immersed in the lives and not in the values and norms of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is something that developed at the very end of the 20th century with the privatization of a lot of welfare provisions. So to satisfy the demands of a more aggressive market economy. So theories like Ben Anderson argued that to legitimate itself, neoliberalism had to create structures of feeling, So Ben Anderson argues that these structures of feeling, quote, envelop and animate neoliberal reason as it emerges, circulates, and changes. Yeah, end of quotes. Drawing on this in their article on the psychology of neoliberalism, Glenn Adams and others remind us that through media and popular culture, neoliberalism holds the promise that to achieve happiness, one should be guided by self-interest and a conscious will to improve oneself within pre-established ideas of social success. There is therefore a clear emphasis on self-regulation, which imposes constant work on the self and debilitates solidarity with others. Within neoliberalism, there is a discourse of freedom and self-expression. However, negative affects are seen as the failure of the individual. Therefore, as Adams and others tell us, certain emotions and life conditions are stigmatized as being produced by, quote, poor choices, lack of willpower, and deficient attributes, end of quote. So much of the suffering of Rooney's characters originates from this need to hide the shame of the perceived poor choices, lack of willpower, or deficient attributes. They need to hide their feelings of vulnerability. Yeah? And it is only when these constraints are overcome that they are able to have a sense of self-respect and self-worth. Yeah, this is something that we will discuss in further detail. So the early chapters of Normal People focus on the protagonist's life at high school, yeah, which features as a microcosm of neoliberal society. These episodes reminds us of, as Imogen Tyler argues, that the culture of neoliberalism relies on, quotes, revolting aesthetics, end of quotes, which vilifies non-conforming attitudes and supervises the appearance and presentation of the body. At high school, Marian's non-conventional behavior makes her an object of disgust among the classmates, who spread rumors that she's been to mental hospital. Yeah, this impression is reinforced by the fact that she's seen not to take care of her body. So through Connell, the other protagonist, we learn, quote, people have said that she doesn't shave her legs or anything, end of quotes. The same character, Connell, later describes Marian's awkwardness in this way, quotes, Marian has never been with anyone in school. No one has ever seen her undressed. No one even knows if she likes boys or girls. She won't tell anyone. People resent that about her. So if people resent her behavior, it is because, unlike these other people, Marian seeks no praise or popularity and remains apparently indifferent to others' opinions. Yet within this millennial environment, power structures are firmly established, as Marian herself acknowledges, in quotes. Everyone has to pretend not to notice that their social lives are arranged hierarchically, with certain people at the top, some jostling at mid-level and others lower down. Marian pictures herself off the ladder completely, not affected by its mechanics, end of quote. Paradoxically, despite her words, Marian is in fact affected by these mechanics and becomes an object of disgust among the classmates. Their cruelty is an example of how the mechanism of social regulation operates effectively. Some chapters later, the situation dramatically changes and both Marian and Connell start studying at Trinity College, Dublin, where she becomes a popular girl. Yeah, so she now transcends the revolting aesthetics of neoliberalism and adopts a very conventional behavior. She starts wearing makeup, she hosts house parties, she acts as a funny girl, and Marian is aware also of, quote, acting a part in the quotes when she starts a relationship with a boyfriend, an upper class boyfriend, and in order to please him, she satisfies his demands his desires for power. And she objectifies herself in sexual relationships which involve violence and subjugation. However, when she decides to abandon him, Jamie starts sharing sexual pictures and videos of her. So victimized, Marianne, instead of receiving support, she's ridiculed by others. One of her best friends, Peggy, abandons her. And once again, Marianne becomes an object of disgust. And she loses her footing, quote, her footing in the social world, end of quote. This negative situation, however, brings with it a sense of rebellion in Marianne. She now despises the systemic cruelty that Peggy and Jamie represent, and I quote, Peggy and Jamie were not very good people, bad people even, who took joy in putting others down. She'd participated in the commodity market. So it is nice to see how Rooney links the behavior of Peggy and Jamie to the commodity market, to the ethics of the dynamics of capitalism, and neoliberalism. So in the novel, likability normally gravitates towards self-objectification, which then becomes the normal behavior among millennials. This objectification aggravates sexism, thwarts empathy, and increases vulnerability. In normal people, objectification doesn't simply emanate from characters, since they are surrounded by social expectations to objectify themselves and others. In normal people, therefore, millennial life is affected by neoliberal values, which are depicted as obstacles to intimacy and expression of emotional truths. As indicated at the beginning, Marianne and Cannell start a relationship at the beginning of the story, but Cannell imposed secrecy on his relationship with her. And for years, Cannell believes that his attraction to her endangers his desire to be a normal, well-adjusted person. Yet, for Cannell, being with her in their intimate moments away from the gaze of others, being with her was, quote, to open a door away from normal life, end of quotes. He even adds that, quote, with Marianne, it was different because everything was between them only, even awkward and difficult things. So despite his feelings for her, for much of the story, Cannell identifies his dependence on Marianne as a personal weakness, as a kind of vulnerability. So in normal people, there is this constant dialectic, what it means to be normal and upward. And paradoxically, and this happens every time, all efforts to be normal end up increasing the character's vulnerability. Another side of Cannell's vulnerability concerns his economic precarity. When he's in Dublin with Marianne, Cannell struggles with class-related anxieties and develops, quote, a sense of crushing inferiority, end of quote. He resents that people will see him as Marianne's working class friend and realizes that he, quote, he and Marianne never talked about money. Lack of money is definitely a taboo subject, and this shameful silence provokes one of their separations in the story. In an episode where Cannell fails to tell Marianne the reason why he has to move out of his Dublin apartment and return home to rural Ireland. His inability to tell Marianne about it is a problem, and she interprets this as if he were abandoning her, so she becomes cold and distant. Both Marianne and Cannell are suffering, but they hide their suffering to appear as independent, as invulnerable. In the case of Cannell, he very consciously represses his tears. Yeah. Um, and this is another issue to talk about, the fact that Canel also is affected by these neoliberal values and capitalist norms, which he constantly criticizes. So he's aware of that, even though he's affected by it. Yeah. So as was suggested before, Rooney's millennial characters are highly aware of inequalities, yet they are unable to fight against them. In this respect, as critic Orly Starling claims about Rooney's characters, quotes, they represent the paralysis of capitalism, in which millennial experiences and choices are predetermined by crippling capitalist norms, end of quotes. There is a turning point in the story right after both crises that Marianne and Connell suffered. Yeah, and this is the suicide of Rob, one of their classmates. And about this, Connell realizes that just like him, Rob, quote, wanted to be normal, to conceal the parts of himself that he found shameful and confusing, end of quote. Connell falls into depression, and this is devastating, and she suffers. But this eventually leads to a rejection of social pressures to be likable. Yeah. So from then on, vulnerabilities are more openly discussed, and Connell and Marianne gradually break their silences on their previous conflicts and misunderstandings. In the final parts of the novel, the text gestures towards these ethics of care, which we discussed earlier. Yeah, this happens at a moment when both of them have overcome their anxieties to be normal, to be seen as normal people. Yeah, we have a lot of examples before that in which they are unable to understand themselves. Yeah, what is happening to them. And this is one of the quotes, yeah, by Connell, quote, they had the same unnameable spiritual injury. Yeah, so there comes a moment when he realizes of the common injury, which is not given a name, yeah, because the neoliberalism does not provide them with the vocabulary to understand themselves. This is a process that begins to be developed at the final parts of the text. The other character, Marianne, also has this transformation, and we see her how she realizes at the very end, quote, how strange to feel herself so completely under the control of another person, but also how ordinary. No one can be independent of other people completely. So why not give up the attempt, she thought, go running in the other direction, depend on people for everything and allow them to depend on you. Why not? So Marianne's final transformation, like that of Connell, recalls Judith Butler's words in one of her articles on vulnerability and its connections with the curve of ethics and neoliberalism. Yeah, so I quote, the life of the other, the life that is not our own, is also our life, since whatever sense our life has is derived precisely from this sociality, this being already and from the start dependent on the word of others, constituted in and by a social word, end of quote. Such indication of interdependency is what we witness in Sally Rooney's Normal People, and this indication of interdependency also contradicts our current neoliberal principles of autonomy, individualism, competition, and materialism, which hinder the recognition of our embeddedness in the lives of other people. In Normal People, yeah, Rooney takes her readers into this millennial world of normative behaviors and ingrained hierarchies along the lines of gender and social class. These are attitudes that foster objectification and construct emotional injury as a personal shortcoming and a sign of abnormality. Against this framework, Rooney articulates a notion of the self as relationship-oriented, where the individual gains self-respect, moral maturity, and self-worth through mutual caring and the acceptance of one's and the other's vulnerability. So this is all for us for the presentation, and thank you very much for listening.